Greetings and welcome. We are in now a continuing conversation with T S Eliot, and more particularly as juniors now, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. As juniors, we will spend only our time for T S Eliot with this very text. Now, in our previous conversation, we A, gave a little bit of background on T S Eliot. B, we read the text. C, we began a process of kind of going through a level one introduction to what's up with Prufrock. What I want to do today now is I want to turn to a simple, not so simple question, and it's this one for your notes. So you might want to write it down. What is Prufrock's deal? See, I told you, I just asked a very simple question. What is Prufrock's deal? What's his problem? What's his concern? Now, notice the irony. I've asked this in the form of a question. Notice the poem says, "Oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make our visit." Note the irony. Don't ask questions, and yet the entire poem is nothing but
Question.
right. We finished our previous conversation with maybe the penultimate question, do I dare disturb the universe? And so now we want to come back to that question, and we want to ask about Prufrock and about his question regarding the disturbance of the universe. Why does he ask a question like this, do you think? What can you gain from the lines of the poem that tell you that Prufrock will disturb the universe in the future or will never disturb the universe in the future? How many of you think Prufrock's going to disturb the universe in the future? Why? What leads you in this poem to believe that he is going to make some kind of conscious adjustment and go forward? What we're really asking, by the way, is do you read this poem in a positive light or do you read this poem in a more negative light? If you say Prufrock is going to make adjustments to disturb the universe, then you read this poem as a Prufrock personae who is in fact hopeful. Things are going forward. If on the other hand you read this poem as, no, the very fact that he asks these kinds of questions proves that he probably isn't going to disturb the universe, you probably read this poem as more like a really sad, depressive kind of. Before we answer this question, though, let's begin with a word. Okay? Alienation. Alienation. Now, the poets that we'll be looking at in the modernist era are by and large really interested in this question of alienation. Do you have a working definition in your notes for even what that means? What does it mean, alienation? What's a good working definition of alienation? To feel alienated means what?
Isolated.
Isolated. Good, keep going.
From your own group.
Outside of the group. Don't fit in. You don't feel like you fit in.
Well, you've been made alien
Somehow
by the group that
you have somehow been separated from.
be.
It can be, in fact, self-chosen alienation. That is to say, I don't associate. Or it can be, I would very much like to be in the populace, but they won't let me in. I feel alienated. It can work both ways. Right? But now I want to talk about the alienation of modernity. That's a different project from just a small group. Modernity, over-related to the modern. Okay? Poets increasingly pointed out, into the 1920s and beyond, that there was a cultural sense, increasingly, of alienation vis-a-vis technology. How so? How so? How is it possible that humans would begin to feel increasingly alienated because of technologies? And the events, of course, from the 1920s on, the wars, the Great Depression, Prohibition, lots of tension happening in the 20th century, right? Lots of struggle and tension. Question, is Prufrock alienated?
It's miserable.
He seems miserable. Can you give me specific lines from this poem that show you that Prufrock is miserable, over-related to misery? Notice he'll ask a second time on page 710, line 45 or so, do I dare disturb the universe? And then he'll make the observation, there is time in a minute, there's time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. I can always go back. I can always change things up. If I try something, I can always go back. And then he goes down a very interesting road. Take a look at the lines starting on at lines 55 on page 710. He says, I've known eyes already. I've known them all. Eyes that are that fix you in a formulated phrase. We're thinking here, obviously, maybe about women's eyes, right? And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pen, when I am pinned and wriggling on a wall, what is the word picture that he imagines himself to be? Right, brilliant. It's like being in, did you guys ever do this when you were kids and they sent you out to find all the beetles at the park? And you had to put them in some kind of, material that would deaden them, and then you would stick a pin through their body into a piece of cardboard, and then you would write about what kind of bug or whatever it was.
A hookworm.
Prufrock says, I feel like I'm one of those bugs in a collection, but I'm not completely dead. I've been pinned up against it, but he's still wiggling, which seems to suggest that he's trying to get away. Yeah, and he can't get away. He's kind of pinned, wriggling, wants to somehow escape. Then he says, once I'm pinned and can't get away, how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways? And how should I presume? In other words, what does he say? Even if I could get away. See this interesting observation. Yeah, Prufrock's got a chance to disturb the universe. What does he say himself about that? Even if I could get away. Even if I had the chance to get out of the bug collection. By the way, that's an interesting word picture. How are people who work every day in the same cloistered job like in a bug collection?
They have their certain spot.
They go every day.
Cubicle.
Wait a minute, though. You were sitting right there yesterday. A junior of mine once said, what you cannot see are the hinges on the roof of this building, which allow for someone to take the roof and go like this and pull it back. And if you were looking at it straight down, this building would look like a bug display with all of the little bugs pinned and wriggling on a wall, trying to get away, but unable to get away. How is life and the daily rhythms of life kind of like being in a bug collection? The days, he says, and the ways. What does it mean to say, I've measured out my life in coffee spoons? What does that even mean? Mr. Tonkovich, my colleague, loves this poem. And many years ago, we had a round table where we talked with students about this poem. And this was one of his favorite word pictures. I've measured out my life in coffee spoons. I don't even know what it means, though. What does it mean? What's the literal word picture mean?
Your little sugar spoon that you pour into your coffee.
In your coffee or your tea, right? Meaning what, though? What does that mean? I've measured out my life in coffee spoons. Means what?
You got one every day.
Every day, repetitive, over and over and over. That's literally what it means. But what is he actually saying? I mean, is he saying, I've measured out my life in coffee spoons as, yay, I've measured out? No. So you got a sense. What's he saying when he says it this way? What's the energy that he is displaying when he says it this way?
Travis Bickle.
Over and over and over. In other words, I've done the same thing. Notice, young or old, Prufrock, young or old. It's old. He's old. It's over. In other words, he says about his life, this is what I did. To drive the point home, some of the most poetic of the lines. Now, I gotta be honest. The first time I was introduced to this poem, I hate to admit this, but I'll share it. I don't share a lot of my biography, but I'll share this. I was sitting in a class being lectured by a very important poet, Virginia Gilbert, and I wasn't paying attention. And all of a sudden I heard her somewhere, you know how you do this? Well, you guys always pay attention, so you don't know what this is like. But, I mean, some students do this, where they kind of daydream about other things or whatever. And I heard these lines. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And I was snapped back into awareness, and I said to her, what did you just say? Do that again. And she said, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And I went, oh, that is way cool. Where'd that come from? Did you write that? And she went, I'm quoting from T S Eliot's Prufrock, if you've been paying attention. I was like, oh. And at that point, this poem, it kind of had me, you know what I mean? The way I said it is anybody can say, I wish I had been born a crab crawling across the bottom of the ocean. It takes a poet to say, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. But now that we've looked at the lines, and they're right there on 710, notice he will finish by saying, and again, asking the question, shall I say I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows? And then finally, in this poem of questions, we get an affirmation. We actually get a statement. He actually says something positive about who he is. And that positive affirmation, not a question, is what? I wish I was just a crab at the bottom of the ocean? Let's point out what's ironic about the fact that he mentions oceans. How does the poem end?
He's drowning.
Mermaids and drowning, right? Right. Singing mermaids.
Crabs can't go forward or backwards though.
That's important, isn't it? Crabs seem to kind of often have this perception of being stuck. We're back to being stuck again. To being alienated. A lonely crab crawling across the floors of what kind of seas?
Silent.
What is that? What do you want to say about that? What's interesting about that? Silent seas. Notice the poem begins with all kinds of
Not
noise.
terribly a lot of sounds underneath the ocean.
Yeah. The poem begins with lots of noise. Talking women. But they're talking about Michelangelo. Meaning what? Can you deduce what that means? In the room, the women come and go talking of Michelangelo. Means what? Right, frivolities. Nothing, right, nothing. In other words, they're talking about either things they don't know or things that don't matter. Coffee spoons. Right? And then he goes right back to questions again. I'm on page 710. Shall I say, I've gone at dusk through narrow streets? And then we jump down to the last line on 710. And in the afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers. Notice the top of 711. Asleep, tired, or at malinger, stretched on the floor here beside. Back to the let us go then, you and me. And now back to more questions. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Uh-oh, what's his concern here? What's his concern here? After we eat, after we do our little drink, do I have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Means what? What is the language here? What's he talking about? Got any idea? He's with this girl, and he asks, yeah, this is just pure sex, isn't it? Do I have the actual energy to do this sex thing anymore?
You're trying to get a room full of juniors to say that?
Right. See, this is the fatigue factor, right? This is the fatigue factor. It's like, but notice it comes in the form of a question. Do I have the strength? But then he says something interesting. Though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I've seen my head, parenthetic, grown slightly bald, in parenthetic. See, he's still interested in the fact that he's losing his hair, right? Notice he says about himself, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. What is that all about? What is this thing about having a head brought in on a platter? This is a biblical reference. There will be several biblical references in this poem. Of course, we mentioned Lazarus here in a bit. Who said John the Baptist? Yes, this is the John the Baptist reference, isn't it? Poor John the Baptist. He makes too much problems for the sitting powers that be. And the next thing we know, he comes in with his head dissevered from his body and on a platter. Right. What is being said here? I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker. I've had juniors that say this is one of the more compelling word pictures in all poetry that they've ever read. I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker. What's the word picture there?
People peeking.
Your life is kind of like a what? What flickers?
Light bulb.
A light bulb or
Flame.
a candle. So if you think of your life as a candle, he says about his candle what? Right. It's starting to flicker. Oh no, right? I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker. But look at the next one. And I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. It's like imagining that your whole life is being at a grand party. Oh no, it's time to go. On your way out the door, death takes your overcoat and is going to have you put, and as you're putting your arms into the sleeves of your overcoat that death is holding, death starts snickering at you, laughing at you. The footman holding the laugh. And then the next line. And in short, what's he saying?
I was afraid.
I was afraid. What do you make of these lines? He's ready to come to the end of his life. He imagines death holding the coat for him as he's leaving. And death kind of laughs at him. What's being suggested about that? Death snickering. Suggesting what? About his life. About his existence.
Nothing.
It's kind of a joke, right? It's kind of a joke. Notice the continuation. A series of would it have been worth it after all? Right? Would it have been worth it after all? After the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worth it to have bitten off the matter with a smile, squeezing the universe into a ball? What is this thing with Lazarus? Are we familiar with the John 11 story? What are we talking about? Lazarus is an important moment in the Judeo-Christian New Testament. Why? Lazarus dies.
Comes back.
It's one of the more interesting stories because supposedly he is resurrected from the dead, and upon resurrection is never mentioned again. It's quite fascinating. We don't know, but it's obviously an interesting question. What did Lazarus have to say? He's been dead for 3 days. Certainly he's got something interesting to say about what it's like on the other side. He imagines, maybe I could come back and say something. And then, one settling a pillow by her head should say, no, that's not it at all. Line 104 for many juniors is the penultimate line of the poem. And it's the line that they resonate often with themselves. Notice the poem. So many lines. And yet, line 104 says, it is impossible to say just what I mean. Some have argued this is T S Eliot's rendering of the modern condition. We talk lots and lots of words. We could hit the print key on the number of texts you sent last year, and it would be thousands of printed pages for most of you. And yet, about those pages and the words on those pages, we might ask, how many of those words actually had much meaning?
The sound of silence.
Simon and Garfunkel's song comes to mind, doesn't it? Right. The sounds of silence. Notice, he wants to say something, but he can't say anything. And finally, he says, I'm not Prince Hamlet. Now, this is a hard one because you haven't studied Hamlet yet. In the play Hamlet, you have a young man named Hamlet who has to avenge the death of his father. And you have an old fart named Polonius, who's kind of the fool of the play. Prufrock will say, I'm not like young man Hamlet. I'm not a man of action. I'm really just a fool. Notice he says, at times, I'm the fool. Wow. Finally, let's go to 3B in your notes. If you had to give any advice to Prufrock, what would it be? Jot it down real quickly. What would your advice to Prufrock be? if you had to say, hey, Prufrock, let me give you some counsel, let me give you some advice here, what would it be? What's one thing you would say to him? Can you give him any hope? Can you give him any joy? Would you say to him, well, at least you didn't have to take honors junior English?